He hadn't cried at his daughter's funeral. He hadn't cried when his wife packed her bags and drove away without looking back. He hadn't cried through 3 years of Montana winters, so long and so silent that some mornings the only proof he was still alive was the sound of his own boots on the frozen ground. But the night a stranger knocked on his gate in the cold and said 7 quiet words, James Rourke felt something shift inside his chest, something that had been locked for so long he had forgotten it was ever meant to open. It was the 3rd week of November, the kind of cold that arrives in Montana without announcement, settling into the land the way old sorrow settles into a man, slowly, completely, until you can no longer remember what warmth felt like. The Harper farm sat at the end of a gravel road that most people in Clearwater County had stopped driving down years ago. The fencing along the property line leaned at tired angles. The cottonwood trees had shed everything they had. The farmhouse itself was solid enough. James kept it functional the way he kept himself functional, with discipline rather than love. But there were no lights in most of the windows, no smoke from the second chimney, no signs that life inside that house went beyond the bare requirement of continuing. James Rourke was 53 years old. He had served 22 years as a Navy SEAL, 3 deployments, classified operations, the kind of service that leaves marks on a man that no one can see and no one asks about. He had come home from it all intact. He had survived things that most people would not survive. And then, one Tuesday morning in March, 4 years ago, his phone rang while he was on base. It was a state trooper. His daughter, Gracie, 17 years old, the one good thing he was absolutely certain he had done right in this life, had been killed in a car accident on the highway outside Billings. He did not make it home in time. He arrived to a funeral instead of a hospital, to a closed casket instead of a daughter, to a wife who held his hand at the graveside and then, 6 months later, let it go for the last time. Margaret left for her sister's home in Oregon. She left gently. She left with sorrow and not anger, but she left. And James came here, to his grandfather's old farm, to the silence he had decided was the only honest thing left. His one companion was a dog named Ranger, a 10-year-old black German shepherd, retired military working dog who had served alongside James in his final deployment. His muzzle had gone silver, his hips were stiff in the mornings, but his eyes were still sharp, still watchful, still holding the quiet steadiness of an animal that has seen hard things and chosen, in spite of them, to remain loyal. Ranger trusted no one outside this property. He had not warmed to a single visitor in 3 years. James understood that perfectly. He felt the same way.
That evening, James was walking back from the barn when Ranger stopped. Not a growl, not aggression, just that precise, total stillness that trained animals use when something requires full attention. James followed the dog's eyes toward the gravel road and stood very still himself. Someone was walking up the road. Not driving, walking. A woman. A heavy coat darkened at the shoulders by the damp cold. A canvas bag hanging from one shoulder, pulling her slightly sideways with its weight. One hand resting low against her stomach, and the reason for that was unmistakable. She was pregnant, heavily so, the kind of far along that makes every step look like a careful decision. Her boots were soaked through. Her face, as she came close enough for James to read it, was pale and exhausted in a way that went deeper than tired. This was a woman who had been running on empty for a long time and had finally stopped running because there was simply nowhere left to go. She reached his fence and stopped. She looked at him. She did not cry. She did not plead. She straightened her shoulders slightly, a small automatic gesture of dignity, and said, "If you let me stay, I'll work on your farm." Her voice was quiet and steady.
I can cook and clean and fix things. I'm not asking for charity. A pause, just a breath. I haven't eaten since yesterday morning. James looked at her for a long moment. 22 years of reading people in high-stakes environments had made him precise about this, about separating performance from truth, manipulation from genuine desperation. What he saw in her face was not a woman running a con. It was a woman who had used everything she had just to walk up this road and say these words with her chin level. He was about to say no. The word was right there. He had said no to everything for 3 years, to his former commander's calls, to his sister's holiday invitations, to neighbors who stopped by with food in the early months after he arrived. No was the wall. No was the only thing keeping the rest of him together. Then Ranger walked forward, slowly, stiffly, with his old hips and his silver muzzle. The dog crossed to the fence, stepped through the gap, and sat down beside the woman. Not touching her, simply beside her. Choosing her plainly and without hesitation, in the way that dogs choose, without politics, without self-protection, without any reason except that something true had been recognized. James stood very still. Then he opened the gate. 1 week, he said. I'm not promising more than that. Her name was Claire Holloway. She was 34 years old, originally from Tennessee. Her husband Daniel had been an electrician, a steady, kind man who loved her well and died in a workplace accident 13 months ago, something with faulty wiring in a commercial building, fast and senseless and completely without warning. The insurance settlement was tied up in a legal dispute she didn't have the money to fight. The apartment went, the savings went. Her mother was in a care facility. Her brother had 4 children and a mortgage, and shame in his eyes every time she called. She had worked what jobs she could find, diner work, cleaning work, anything that would take a visibly pregnant woman, until the work stopped coming. She had ridden a bus as far as her last $20 would take her, and when the bus broke down 12 miles outside Clearwater, she had walked the rest. She didn't tell James all of this the first night. She told him almost none of it. She ate the soup he heated without comment, said thank you quietly, and went upstairs to the room he showed her without asking for anything else. James sat at the kitchen table after she went up and looked at the wall for a long time. He told himself this was temporary. He told himself this changed nothing. The house began to change anyway. Not dramatically, not in ways that announced themselves. Coffee was ready before he came in from the morning feeding. The back door hinge, which had scraped wrong for 2 years and which he had simply learned to tolerate, was fixed one afternoon while he was in the fields. She restacked the firewood along the north wall properly, the way someone taught by someone who understood serious winters would do it. She did not ask him questions. She did not try to fill silences with conversation. She simply worked steadily and without complaint, and the house around her slowly stopped sounding the way an empty house sounds, that particular hollow echo that accumulates in rooms where no one has truly lived for a long time. Ranger followed her everywhere. James noticed this and said nothing, but one afternoon he came in from the barn and stopped in the kitchen doorway. Ranger was lying on the floor with his old gray muzzle resting gently, carefully against Claire's belly. The dog's eyes were half closed. Claire had one hand resting on top of his head. Then the baby moved, a visible rolling shift beneath her shirt, and Ranger opened his eyes fully and raised his head slowly, and his tail swept the kitchen floor once, twice, 3 times. Claire laughed, a small, surprised sound, the kind of laugh that escapes before a person can decide whether they have the energy for it. James stood in the doorway watching and felt something move through him that was not grief and not quite joy, but something that lived in the space between them, something he had not felt in so long that he almost didn't recognize it. He turned and went back outside before either of them could see his face. The storm came in the second week of December, the kind of Montana storm that simply takes over. No warning, no apology, just wind and darkness and the power going out before supper was finished. James lit the oil lamps. They sat at the kitchen table with the lamplight making the room smaller and warmer than it had felt in years. The wind worked against the walls. At some point, the silence between them changed. Quality became less like two strangers being careful and more like two people who had decided, without discussing it, that careful was exhausting. Claire asked about the empty spaces on the walls, the hooks with nothing on them, the places where photographs had clearly once hung. James was quiet for a long time, and then, because the storm was loud and the room was warm, and he was tired in a way that went deeper than physical, tired of carrying it alone, he told her about Gracie, about the phone call, about the state trooper's voice, about arriving home to a closed casket and a church full of people who looked at him with pity he didn't know what to do with, about Margaret leaving, about choosing this farm and this silence as something that felt at least like honesty. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't break down, but when he said Gracie's name, his voice changed, thickened slightly, the way a strong thing changes when it admits just once how long it has been holding. Claire listened to all of it without filling the spaces. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, she knew. Whatever you think you should have done differently, she knew exactly who her father was. James looked at the lamp flame. Something behind his eyes shifted, tightened, then slowly released. He nodded once. They didn't speak much after that, but the silence that followed was different from every silence that had come before it. It was 3 weeks later that a truck James didn't recognize came down the gravel road. A man got out, younger than James, early 30s, a hard look about him. He said his name was Kevin Marsh, said he and Claire had history, said she owed him money, a loan he called it, from before Daniel died, and he had tracked her here through her brother. He stood in the yard with his hands in his jacket pockets and spoke in the careful tone of someone who has learned to make threats sound like reasonable conversation. James listened to all of it from the porch steps. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't move quickly. He simply looked at the man with the particular quality of stillness that 22 years of special operations builds into a person. A stillness that communicates, without a single word, that the man standing in front of you has been in situations that would genuinely frighten you, and that he is entirely calm. Kevin Marsh finished talking. James said very quietly, "Get back in your truck." Something in the way he said it, not a threat, simply a fact being stated, made the man look at him differently. There was a pause. Then Kevin Marsh got back in his truck. He drove away and did not come back. James went inside and said nothing about it to Claire. She never asked, but that evening she looked at him across the kitchen with an expression that said she understood exactly what had happened and exactly what it had cost him nothing, and that she was grateful in a way that went beyond words. The night Rose was born was the coldest night of the year. James woke to Claire's voice through the wall, steady, urgent, the sound of someone who needed help right now. He was moving before he was fully awake, pulling on his boots in the dark hallway, grabbing his keys. The roads were ice. He drove with both hands and everything he had, the truck sliding twice on the curves before the highway straightened out. Ranger rode in the back seat without being invited. At the hospital, James sat in the waiting room alone. Plastic chairs, fluorescent lights, a television in the corner showing something no one was watching. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands folded, and he thought about Gracie. Not with the crushing weight he usually carried her with, but gently, almost tenderly, the way you think about someone when you are in a place where life and its fragility are very close to the surface. He thought about how much she would have liked Claire, how she would have made faces at the baby and chosen the name and reorganized the nursery 3 times. He thought about how grief and love are not opposites, how they are, in fact, the same thing wearing different clothes depending on the day. When the nurse came through the door smiling, James pressed his hands against his face for a moment. Just a moment. Not from sadness, from something without a clean name, relief and loss and gratitude, all arriving together the way they always do when new life enters a room that has known grief.
She named the baby Rose. 7 pounds, 3 ounces, eyes already paying attention. James drove them home on a morning when the snow had stopped and the sky was that particular pale blue that Montana produces sometimes in winter, like a quiet apology. He had spent the previous days finishing the upstairs room without telling her, a second-hand crib, fresh white paint, curtains hung straight. When Claire stood in the doorway holding Rose and saw what he had done, she didn't speak for a long moment. She looked at the room and then at him and pressed her lips together and nodded slowly, the way people nod when words would be smaller than what they feel. February came, then March. The 1-week arrangement had dissolved so gradually that neither of them could have named the day it ended. They had fallen into the rhythms of the farm together, the morning work, the evening quiet, the particular ease that develops between 2 people who have both been through enough to have stopped performing. James put a photograph back on the wall, just one. Gracie, at 12 years old, standing in front of a Christmas tree, squinting against the flash, with a grin that was entirely his. He stood looking at it for a long time after he hung it, not with the weight he used to carry, with something quieter, something closer to gratitude for having known her at all. In early April, Claire set papers on the kitchen table, a job in Billings, an apartment she could afford. She was ready. She had built something from nothing, and she was ready to walk forward into it. James looked at the papers and said, "Billings is a good city." His voice was even. His hands were still. Claire looked at him across the table. "She's going to need people," she said, "real ones, people who know what it means to show up." James looked at Rose in the small chair by the window, the baby's eyes moving with that complete and uncomplicated attention she gave to everything. Claire said softer now, "I was thinking that she might need someone steady, someone she could call." A pause. "I was thinking she might need someone steady, someone she could call." A pause. "I was thinking she might need a grandfather." The word entered him quietly and broke something open that had been sealed for 4 years. James stood up from the table. He walked to the window. He stood there for a moment with his back to the room and his jaw working. Then he turned around. "You call me when you get there," he said, "so I know the roads were clear." Claire smiled through her eyes being full. "I will." She drove down the gravel road the next morning, and James stood on the porch watching until the truck was gone past the cottonwood trees. Ranger leaned against his leg. The farm was quiet. The fields were beginning to show the first faint color of spring, pale green at the edges, tentative and new, the land remembering slowly what it was capable of. James went inside, made coffee, stood at the kitchen window with the cup warm in his hands. On the wall behind him, Gracie smiled. On the hook by the door, Rose's first knitted cap hung like a small and certain promise. And James Rourke, who had spent 4 years building walls against everything that could reach him, understood finally what the bravest men take the longest to learn. That the hardest operation he had ever run was not behind enemy lines. It was this, standing still long enough to let someone in, keeping the gate open, choosing, after everything, to remain.
If this story reached something inside you, if it reminded you of someone you loved or a life that deserved more than it received, please subscribe to the 11th Hour Last Words.